Hello, my name is Christopher DeLay. I'm a Premier Field Engineer for Microsoft. Today, in a previous video, I discussed migrating a PKI to Windows Server 2012. In this video, I'm going to cover some of the things you may need to consider if you actually want to change the host name for the CA during a migration. So starting with Windows Server 2008 R2, there's been the capability to actually change the host name when you are migrating a CA. Prior to Windows 2008 R2, the host name needed to remain the same. So an example of where the host name may change is you're migrating the CA off of a box, off of a machine that has a certain host name, but you want to keep that machine around after the CA is migrated off of it, and you want to maintain that CA. You want to maintain the host name for that machine that was previously the CA. So that's one of the situations that you may run into. If you've properly implemented your PKI, you'll have less issues. So the main concern around when you do a migration to the host name, migrating to a machine that has a different host name, is the AIA and CDP locations may have information that's hard-coded that points to that previous CA. So we're going to go ahead and take a look at my issuing CA pre-migration. So if you look at the AIA and CDP locations in this example, they weren't really set up in accordance with best practices. So in accordance with best practices, these HTTP locations that we see here, we generally recommend that the DNS name used in these locations are either C names or A records that point to a DNS name that's not the CA name, because this makes it a little bit of a challenge if I'm migrating to a machine but changing the name, especially if you're keeping those HTTP repositories on the CA, which again is not recommended. Even if you did have that configured properly, you would still run into some issues with the LDAP locations if you're using those. So if we look in here, we see that we have ca01.fabricam.com listed in the HTTP, AIA, and CDP locations. If you also look at these LDAP URLs, you'll also see that CA01 is mentioned in these as well. So that's something we need to go ahead and rectify if we're going to go ahead and migrate to the CA to a machine with a different host name. Other than that, as far as the actual migration steps, they're identical to exactly what you would do with a migration. So I documented that in some of the previous videos that I posted. So we'll just kind of walk through migrating this CA to a machine with a different host name. So let me go ahead and pull up the machine that's going to become the CA. And we'll give that a second to power up. So let's go ahead and log in here. And as you see in this demonstration, I'm just focusing on doing migrating the actual issuing CA to a machine with a different host name. There would be some of the similar implications if you had the same sort of setup on your root CA as well. However, the steps are going to be kind of similar to make those changes. The main difference between this and the root CA, obviously, is since the root CA is offline, more of that stuff is manually published, but there may be some things that you need to tweak there. Now, the other thing I did mention was that this ca01.fabricam.com is not really a best practice for a couple of reasons. One is because I'm actually hosting the AIA and CDP locations on the CA. The second reason is because I'm using a DNS name that points to the CA itself. So this is a problem. So if your environment's set up like this, you'll probably want to change this to something that's more best practice. Even if you decide to keep the AIA and CDP locations on the CA, you'll probably want to at least change this to a DNS name that's not pointed to the host name of this CA. The issue is, even if you go ahead and do that, so if I go ahead and change that to something that fits best practices, that's definitely good. The problem is all my previous issued certificates are going to have that information stamped on there. So that has a couple implications. So if I really want to get rid of the CAO.1 being available, being in any certificates that I've issued, I basically would have to do a couple things. If my root CA was configured to have this location, in other words, I was using the issuing CA as a AIA and CDP repository for the root CA as well, then at that point I would actually have to reconfigure my root CA and reissue my subordinate CA to fix that issue, and then from the subordinate CA I would have to reissue all my entity certificates to totally make that change over to that new name that I'm putting there in the AIA and CDP locations. So if I want to do that, again, the steps would be, reconfigure the AIA and CDP locations on the root and issuing CA. You'd have to reissue the issuing CA and then reissue all your end entity certs. If you didn't do those steps, then you would still have certificates that you issued that point back to, in this example, cao1.fabricam.com. So my replacement issuing CA is still powering up. We're almost there, almost ready to go. The other problem that you create, that's a pretty obvious one though, is when you use the host name of the CA, it obviously makes it harder to move that HTTP location off. It actually makes it kind of impossible to move that off to something other than the CA. So best practices, sort of dictate that those AIA and CDP locations should be hosted off the CA. So it makes it impossible to move it off there without changing it first. And of course, since it's pointing to a machine name, it makes it impossible to make that location high available or load balance it. So those are a lot of the issues. So these are things you definitely want to look to addressing in your environment if you have these sort of issues. Okay, so this is my Windows Server 2012 server. This is the server that's going to replace my CA. So what I'm going to want to do is I'm going to want to make sure its IP has an IP address, make sure it's domain joined, and make sure that, and since we're doing a demo on changing the host name, we'll make sure that the host name is actually going to go ahead and be different on this machine. So here we go. So here I have my computer name. I'm going to need to change that. And might need to do some IP addressing stuff as well. So it looks like the IP address is set, so I just need to go ahead and change this stuff. So let me just go ahead and click there. So I'm just going to go ahead and change it, and I'm going to call it not CAO1. And then join it to the domain, which is fabricam.com. Put in my credentials to authenticate. And so that'll take a second to join the domain here. And we'll go ahead and restart that. So then we need to go back on CAO1, and to do the perform the migration, of course we have to go ahead and back up this CA. So I'm just going to go ahead and go into the C drive. I create a new folder, call it backup. In this folder I'm going to create two new folders. One called CA Backup and one called Config Backup. So to back up the CA, I'm just going to go ahead and go to the CA console, which I don't believe I have open. So I'm just going to go ahead and back up the CA, all tasks, backup CA. Again, you can use cert util or cert util, whatever you want to call it, to do this as well. I'm going to do the private key and CA certificate, certificate database, and certificate database log files. I'm going to go ahead and browse to my CA backup folder. I'm going to go ahead and put a password in to protect the PFX file that's going to be generated, and click finish. Okay, so I also need to back up the CA configuration. I'm not going into too much detail on this because I covered this in some of the previous videos and blogs that I did, and you can go back and use those resources if you need to. So I need to go ahead and back up some different settings here. So the first is the registry. So I'm going to go ahead and open up regedit. I'm going to full screen this. And here's where I'm going to back up: HKey local machine, system, current control set, services, cert service, configuration, name of my CA. So I'm just going to go ahead and export this. And I'm going to export this to my CA backup folder. Actually, I'm sorry. Jumped the gun there. Config backup here. I'm going to just call it reg, just a CA reg. It doesn't really matter what the name is. So I'm going to go ahead and save that. The other thing I would want to get is a list of templates that are available on here, so I can just go into this CA management console, right click on certificate templates, do export list, browse to my C drive, and then go into the backup, and then go into the CA backup folder, config backup again, and I'm just going to call this cert templates. Okay, so I have my backup on here. I'm going to go ahead and copy that backup off. To make it kind of easy, I'm going to go ahead and use the DC as kind of a file server, because I know the DC has the SMB firewall ports open. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy that backup folder there. And let's go check on my new CA, see where we are here. Should be joined to the domain now, so we want to make sure that we log in with the domain enterprise admin account to do the install of the certificate services role. Okay, we're going to let that go ahead and start up, and we're going to go back to my CA. So I copied my backup off, so the next thing I'm going to want to do is uninstall the CA role. So I'm going to go here into Server Manager. Now I'm going to do something a little bit different here. Since the HTTP location of CA01 is hard-coded into certificates for the HTTP and AIA CDP locations, I'm going to need to do some work there to get that to work for the future CA, because people are going to go ahead, and some people that have certificates from the old CA are going to be looking at that ca01.fabricam.com location to download CRILs and CA certificates potentially. So I'll handle that with DNS later. Right now I'm just going to go ahead and go to roles, remove roles. At the very least, I want to uninstall certificate services, so I'm just going to get rid of everything actually. And on the replacement CA, I'm going to go ahead and copy that backup over to here. So I'm going to go back to my DC. Go ahead and copy the backup. Copy it locally here. Okay, so let me go back to my old CA. It needs to restart. That's fine. Do you want to restart now? Yes, that's fine. So I'm going to go ahead now. If we look at this machine, so if we just take a look at what the host name is now. It is not CA01, so it's definitely not the same name as CA01. So we're just going to want to do the restore process. So first we need to install the ADCS binary, so we're just going to do add roles and features. Click next, role based. We're going to do it on this server, obviously, so we're going to select that. We're going to install certificate services, and yes, we want to install the remote server administration tools for certificate services. Go ahead and click next. Features, don't really care right now. ADCS, so it's going to have me customize my installation. I had web enrollment on the other server, so I'm going to bring that over as well. Like the other server, I am going to use this one for demo purposes to host the HTTP AI and CDP locations. Again, not recommended, but we do see that in a lot of environments, and in some environments there may actually be reasons why that's done, even though that organization may understand that reduces, you know, some of the high availability aspects of it. They may have a, you know, they may not have the funds to, you know, if it's a smaller organization, they may not have funds to procure additional servers or license additional OSs or whatever. So I'm going to go ahead and install that. So the problem you have here is, so I'm going to kind of address this as well. So the problem you have here is, so in my example, I had ca01.fabricam.com hosting my AI and CDP locations. So if I'm going to totally decommission, I have kind of a couple choices here. If I'm going to totally decommission CA01, then I could just host that website somewhere else and change the DNS record. That's pretty straightforward. But the question then is, if I'm going to actually decommission CA01, why am I moving to a different host name? Most people that are moving to a different host name are doing it because they want to keep that original name around. So for the rest of this video, I'm going to go ahead and go with the understanding that I'm going to have to keep CA01 around. So that being said, if I'm keeping CA01 around, and I'm gonna have to still host the AI and CDP locations, even if I fix up my new CAs, unless I reissue all the issued certificates, they're still going to be pointed, in my example, back to ca01.fabricam.com for the HTTP AI and CDP locations. So I'm going to at the very least have to have the web server installed on here to host these roles, or to host that information. So with this kind of, with this process, there definitely are a lot of variables and a lot of decision-making processes. There definitely is documentation out there on upgrading and migrating CAs from Microsoft, and you're definitely going to want to read through that documentation. I mean, the purpose of these videos is to kind of give you an idea of how to do it, but if you really want to and really should, get into those technical details, you're going to want to read that documentation. So in here, I'm just going to go ahead and re-add that web server role. Again, this was the machine that was my original CA, and I'm going to go ahead and keep the AIA and CDP locations hosted on here to provide support for those locations that I previously had stamped in certificates. So I'm just going to install all the default stuff for IIS. And we're just kind of curious whether my virtual directories from the previous installation were still there, so we're just going to go ahead and check for that. So my virtual directory from before is still there. So I can point the website here. So now I have, this is really kind of a really complex kind of situation, because now I have all my certificates I've issued before pointed to co1.fabricam.com to support. All my previous clients were pointed to co.1.fabricam.com to get CRLs and certificates. So the issue now is I have kind of a complex situation, because if I want to have the CA, the new CA, still published, still use CA01 as a publication point, then I kind of gonna set up publication back to CA01 and host everything there. If I want to kind of change it, so if I want to use, if I'm saying, okay, I'm doing this migration now, let me change it to something that's best practice, like that's not a machine name, and I change it to something like pki.fabricam.com. That's kind of cool in the sense that we're hosting stuff. We're hosting those AIA and CDP locations now on somewhere that's not the machine name, even if we do in fact host them on the new CA. The problem is I still have to support publishing CRLs back to CA01 because previous clients will have this. So the only way to do like a clean cut is if you change the HTTP DNS location to something that's not a machine name. The best way to do a clean cut is just to reissue all your certificates. Otherwise, you're going to have to maintain these variable locations. So we're still installing the binaries on my new, what's going to become my new CA. And my web server is going ahead and installing on what was my old CA. For those of you that are actually doing this migration, I think this video will definitely cover, you know, some of the different ideas, some of the different considerations you have to do when making this change. However, this video is not going to cover all, you know, what is the decision you're going to make in your environment. Different folks are going to make different decisions at some of these decision points based on, you know, some of the environmental variables. So I can cover how to do some of these things, but I can't really cover what's the best decision for you. I can tell you from a best practice standpoint, the best thing would be to cut over to a new DNS name and reissue all your certificates. That would be my recommendation. However, if you're not going to do that, you're going to have to decide how you're going to do these things. And unfortunately, all the answers for what you're going to do there are not going to be able to be in this video. So that finished installing. So let me go ahead and I'm going to have to go ahead and configure the role. That's fine. I'll accept the credentials there. I'll install both of these roles. So enterprise CA, subordinate CA, use existing private key, select a certificate and use its associated private key, and then I'm going to have to go ahead and import that. So I'm going to go to my CA backup folder, go ahead and import that, type in my password. select that and click next. Next, because I'm going to use the same locations for the database and log files. And so the one thing I didn't really discuss is my CDP location for the LDAP. Even if my HTTP locations are all clean, I'm still going to have an issue with my LDAP locations. So what do I mean by that? So if we look in the, we'll take a look at the configuration after I do this install. And hopefully my restore should bring a lot of this stuff over. So I'm going to go ahead and hit configure here and let that go ahead and do its thing. Okay, so to finish the restore, I'm going to need to go into the certificate services MMC and do right click here, do all tasks, and I need to restore my database now. So click OK. Next, I'm just going to do the certificate database and log files. I'm going to browse to my backup here. Yes. So that's going to go ahead and restart. I'm going to want to merge my registry, so I'm going to go get my registry from the backup. Right click on that and do merge. Yep. Okay. And then I'm going to want to restart this service. And then the other step you would typically want to do is you want to go in and look at this list of templates that you had on the previous CA and make sure the same ones are available. I happen to know these are the default templates that are loaded, so I know there's nothing for me to do here. So I'm just going to go ahead and close that. So we talked a lot about the HTTP location. So for those HTTP locations, I really have a lot of decisions I need to make. So am I going to continue to use that old HTTP, if I'm using an HTTP location that points to the CA, am I going to continue to use that? If I'm going to continue to use that and I need to keep the old machine up, I'm going to need to host those files there and publish files there. If I'm going to move that DNS name, then if I'm going to, if I'm able to change that DNS name, then I can point CA01 at this new box and all the old stuff will continue to work, assuming I'm using this CA to host the AIA and CDP locations from a HTTP standpoint. So that's really kind of a decision you need to make. If you're going to change it to best practices to something like pki.fabricam.com, just remember all those old certs you've issued point back to ca01.fabricam.com, so you're going to have that hosted somewhere as well. So there's a lot of decisions on how you're going to do that. Like I said, the best thing to do would be change it to pki.fabricam.com and kind of reissue all your certificates. That would be the best way to do it from a best practices standpoint. So I've given you the options for what you could do with the HTTP. I'm not going to go into any more detail on that. You're going to have to make those decisions on your own on how you're going to move forward with that. So the next thing we want to talk about specifically is LDAP. So if we go ahead and look at the LDAP location, and we're doing that, let me go ahead and log into my DC as well. So if I look at extensions, so I see here's my HTTP location. Again, I said I recommend changing that to something that's not the CA name, if that's the case in your environment. If the case was you're migrating to a machine name and the HTTP location was not the name of the machine, it was something like pki.fabricam.com, and you're continuing to host that location, you're good to go, because you just need to repoint that DNS to wherever that AIA and CDP location is moving, assuming that is moving. The LDAP location is this string here, which means that it's essentially going to include the name of the CA. So if we go ahead and look in Active Directory, Let's go ahead and open ADSI Edit. We'll see from an LDAP perspective that my CRLs prior to the migration were hosted in CA01 container. Now, since I've migrated to this new machine called not CA01, there's a container generated for that. So what do I do here? How do I handle that? Well, one option is just to go ahead and point it back to the old location. So I'll cover the steps required to go ahead and do that. So really what I just want to go in here is I just want to go into the registry. And again, to make this clear, previous CRLs were published here into CA01 and available from there. Now, right at this point, new CRLs are going to be published into this container and available here. So that means that clients that were previously looking here are going to start to fail unless I fix that some way. So the way I'm going to fix it is I'm just going to change it to publish all new CRLs back to the original CA01 location. So I'm going to go back to my new CA. I'm going to go ahead and open regedit. And going to HQ local machine system, current control set, services, cert service, configuration, name of my CA. I'm going to go into the CRL publication URLs, registry key here. And so you see how you have CN %7, %8, comma, CN equals %2. So you kind of want to know what these variables are if you're changing things. If you go to AskDS, Chris PKI part 2, I have some tables here that you can look through if you want to identify those things. So the one I'm going to change is the %2, which is the server short name of the CA. So right now that variable is going to translate to not CA01, and I want to change it back to CA01. So I'm just going to change this variable back to CA01. And I'm just going to click OK. So now I'm pointing where I'm storing these things as well as what's being stamped in certificates as CA01. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the service after I make this change, and then go ahead and click play here. Okay, so I've made the change, I've restarted the service. I just want to test that I can still publish CRLs there, so I'm going to right click on revoked and do all tasks publish. See if I get any errors when I do that. I may very well get an error because I'm not sure how this new machine would have access to that previous LDAP location. So what I would need to do is I would just need to go into here, into the CA01 container. Let's see what the permissions are on this. The permissions may not be here. This is set to cert publishers. So I think the actual permissions for the object are what's more important here. So I could remove this out since that's gone. So I could remove that, or I could just change it. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go click Advanced here. I click on CA01, Edit, Change, Object Types Computers, OK, not CA01. OK, OK, OK. Of course, if you have many DCs, that may take a little bit of time to go ahead and replicate that change out, but we should be good to go here now. And so let me try to republish that. And we got no errors, so everything's working. So we will see in newly issued certificates, it'll still have that CA01 location, and so both new and old certificates will be leveraging that location. And so what we'll see is that that'll be kind of transparent for users moving forward. They just have to take note of it in your documentation that that you are pointing to that old location on the new CA, or on the new machine that's hosting the CA. So that's just something to be aware of there. So we've gone ahead and taken care of that. Like I said, I talked in detail about the HTTP locations. If you are using something that's not best practice, you're going to have to make a decision on how you're going to handle that. So depending on what decision you make, you're going to have to make adjustments based on that decision. And real quickly, we'll see if we can find the upgrade and migration guide. So this is migration and upgrade. So here we go, Active Directory, Certificate, Services, and Migration. So this will go through and give you what you need to do the migration. So it says if you want the Windows 2008 R2, so I'm not sure if there's a 2012 one yet. There very well may not be. Actually, yeah, this one says it applies to basically everything: Windows Server 2003, 2003 R2, 2008, 2008 R2, and 2012. So you can go ahead and use this guide to get more information about the migration process. So again, in this video we at least discussed what are some of the things you would need to do if you're migrating to a different host name for the CA. What are you going to do for the HTTP location, depending on where you're hosting those AIA and CDP locations and what the specific DNS name is. And then we kind of covered what you would need to do to the LDAP location, how you would need to modify that to support both new and previously issued certificates. So that pretty much concludes all the videos I'm going to do on the upgrade and migration process. If you have any questions, there's a couple places you can try to get in touch with me. Probably the easiest is if you go to chdelay.com, and if you go to contact, there's a form you can fill out and submit a question to me. If it's a real simple question, I'll probably go ahead and just take the time to answer it for you. If it is something that's going to be involved, it's going to take time and be involved, then probably the best way for you to handle that is to open a support case with Microsoft. Also, if you want to, you can go ahead and visit my blog, which is at http://blogs.technet.com/b/xdot509. A little bit of a change here. I am going to periodically continue to blog about PKI stuff, because there are some other things that I want, some other information that I want to get out there. However, as far as my career focus, I'm going to continue to support PKI. However, there are other things that I am looking to take on. So definitely interested in a lot of the cloud things. So for example, Windows Azure infrastructure as a service, definitely looking to support that more. So some of these other technologies I'm looking to go out and support more. So anyways, hope you enjoyed the video. Feel free to submit a comment at my site or to visit my blog. Alright, thank you.